and then make sure that I am not feeding back into anything. There we go. All right. Tim, since you are also on here, well, actually, just to see. All right. Oh, welcome to Merge PHP. This is the November 2025 edition of a collaboration of user groups to provide online virtual events in the PHP community. Hailing from Kansas City, Las Vegas, Vancouver, San Diego, Portland, Seattle, Phoenix, Austin, Boston, Atlanta, and Utah. And as I hit the go button on my slide, there we go. Obligatory logo wall here with the MC and the presenters for today covering up Atlanta. Let me go ahead and move us to another part of the screen. There we go. So, as usual for the month, we have a JetBrains license raffle. Send an email to the email on your screen. The first one, maybe the second one as well, depending on how many licenses we have available, will get a license to a JetBrains product of your choice, up to and including IntelliJ IDEA if you need to write something other than PHP. I've used PHP Storm for an extended period. Day job is doing Go stuff right now, and I'm using Goland for that. And they're still really solid IDEs. 10 out of 10 would recommend if you haven't tried one already. This is a really good chance to get you a copy for a year. As usual, we're showing the PHP supported versions listing here. If you are on PHP 8.1 and 8.2, they are in security fixes only mode. If you're 8.0 or earlier, hopefully your Linux distribution has long-term support, or you're getting long-term support from elsewhere, because otherwise you are not getting security fixes. 8.4 is the current version, at least for a few more weeks. We have a number of upcoming conferences and events. The ones that are highlighted are the ones that are in person in the US. There are a lot of these that are either online or in person in Europe or Asia or other places. Coincidentally, the two announced conferences that are in the States this time around are both in Chicago. DrupalCon in March and PHP Tech in May. I know that PHP Tech is trying something slightly different this year and adding a JS Tech track or so to the conference. If you submitted to PHP Tech already with a JavaScript related topic, submit to JS Tech. It's a little easier to do talk selection on their end if you submit separately. But yeah, hopefully I'll make it out to Chicago for tech, and that's that. We have a number of places on social media where we occasionally post. If you want to hang out online in kind of a chat setting while this meetup is not running, I highly encourage you to hang out at the PHP community Discord. I believe there's a Matrix or IRC bridge that works at least some of the time. Additionally, you can find us on the Fediverse at merge@phpc.social, as well as occasionally on Twitter and such at Merge PHP. But the biggest place to find us, where you're seeing us right now, is YouTube. And so for next month, we'll have a talk by Carlos Agudo on hexagonal architecture code from Open API contracts. Looking forward to that one. That will be second Thursday in December. You can find more information about this on mergephp.com. Additionally, as of January, we are moving 1 hour later. This allows for a little bit easier participation by folks on the West Coast and Pacific time zone, where we will be at 5 p.m. there rather than 4. And makes it a little bit easier on folks in Central and Mountain time zones as well. At least for me, if you're doing an in-person meetup, which we're going to try to do here in Austin soon, 6 p.m. is a little bit early to actually get in the right place at the right time. Traffic's pretty bad, but 7 p.m. is a little bit easier. Since this is a kind of US-based online meetup, that when daylight savings time kicks in later in the year, our time in UTC will float to an hour earlier. So it'll be 7 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern throughout the year, second Thursday of the month, just as we do right now. If you have a talk idea, we rotate off organizers for who kind of chases speakers down and that sort of thing. But we would love to spend less effort doing that. If you have a presentation idea, whether that is a 5, 10, or 15-minute lightning talk or demo, or whether that's a 45 or 50-minute full presentation, we would love to see your talk submissions. If you've got an idea for somebody else to do a talk, submit that too. But it's good seeing folks in the community who we may not have necessarily seen before presenting new topics. So for tonight, we have Daniel Scherzer talking about what's new in PHP 8.5. Over the years, either Tim Bond or I have given some version of this presentation before, but it's like, wait, we have a release manager here somewhere. They're going to know a lot more about exactly what's going on and the path to actual general availability for PHP 8.5. So with that, I'm going to drop myself off screen and bring Daniel on screen and have him screen share from here. Technical difficulties. We'll wait for another minute or two, and Daniel will hop back online, and we'll present at that point. The workaround for when he did this in person at Longhorn PHP a few weeks ago was that he did not run on his own laptop.
So not to give any spoilers while we wait in, but since you have seen a version of this, do you have a favorite feature in 8.5?
Pipe operator is a pretty big deal. And it's kind of interesting seeing how the implementation in PHP differs from the implementation that Hack has had for quite a while now. There are a few other things, but the detriment of running a conference is that unless you're talking about like closing keynote. You don't tend to be able to get to attend an entire talk.
Well, I wasn't there, so I haven't seen this, and I've only very briefly looked at some of the changelog. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is the deprecation of the backtick operator as an alias for shell exec. So I'm wondering if maybe that'll have a new usage in PHP 9 that somebody's kind of cooking up in their head.
Hopefully not. But fortunately, something like that backtick deprecation is something that tools like Rector or such can just clean up the code so that it's an easy upgrade. Bouncing around other languages, upgrade paths on, even though PHP definitely doesn't follow Semver, there are breaking changes in subsequent releases. It's still not a massive undertaking generally to bump up to a newer version, and that's nice. One moment, I'm going to make sure that I'm watching the super secret chat with our speaker. Okay, he should be online in another minute or two. While we're waiting, I want to bounce back to the conferences list because there are a number of here we go. Do this. All right. Let's see if your mic works.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Success.
All right, go ahead and share your screen and I'll swap it in and you are good to present.
Sorry about that, everyone. My thanks to Ian for holding down the fort. Share screen, merge PHP. I do have to make one small correction to what I caught from Ian. And this is but the talk description is slightly outdated. I sent a PO and just 4. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
You can. You're seeing some audio dropouts there. I will let you know if those continue. But I'll stop you if there are audio issues going further.
Okay. With that, welcome to PHP 8.5, new features from the source. My name is Daniel Schurz. I am currently serving as one of the release managers for PHP 8.5. I also wrote a number of the RFCs that were accepted and included in this version, so I have a much deeper understanding of some of the new features. So we're going to start with an overview of those new features, not an exhaustive list. There are a lot of new classes, functions, methods that are not going to be talked about. I'm mostly going to, I believe I cover all of the syntax changes and the biggest new and other functionality. I'm going to talk about the tooling that will understand that usage and or validate, and then any polyfills that are already available. I'm then going to talk about the deprecations, including, I believe someone mentioned the backtick operators. Again, these are deprecations and not removals. And so technically you can just keep using your code and suppress the warnings. You probably shouldn't, but that is an option if you want to use the new features that are not polyfillable and don't want to deal with the deprecations yet. I'll talk about some tooling that will identify the issues for you before your code is running in production, like as part of your GitHub Actions or other continuous integration, and then any tooling that will automatically mitigate the issue for you. Finally, I'll get to some breaking changes and removals, and then pause for questions. First up, the expansion of what is supported in constant expressions. Constant expressions covers attribute parameters, default values for parameters and properties, the values of global constants and class constants. And they now support 3 big new features: closures, constants, constant casts, and first class callables. On the left, we see the closure and the visible. When I was at Longhorn, in one of the talks, someone discussed that in one environment they worked, you had to get security approval before installing any new external package. So if you aren't able to install PHP unit, here is a very primitive test runner. You define a new attribute called tests that will take in a closure, and we'll just run that closure when you call run. And then you see the isPrime function, where the default value for the parameter is the string 123 that is cast to an int. That is now possible in constant expressions. The implementation is for space, but it isn't that hard, and it isn't the point of the demonstration. The point is you can simply run by calling new reflection attribute new instance and then run on that instance of the tests attribute. And of course, it won't have all of PHP unit's nice formatting and assert equals versus assert same and all that power. But you can see that this will validate that your prime number checker function works properly. And if isPrime had been a method rather than a global function, the closure would have access to any private members of the class that it is on. So you could call isPrime, but you could also call underscore isPrime helper or what have you. That's closures and constant casts. For first class callables, we can see that here in string utils. The length constant is a reference to the string length function. The transformed function accepts a parameter for a closure to apply, where the default is to reverse the string, and then it just runs that transformation and returns a new instance. We can see in the code on the left, you can reference the closure, the first class callable that is stored in the constant, by essentially dereferencing it with the extra parentheses. So you see parentheses, string utils, double colon, length, close parentheses, and then the parameters. This is to avoid confusion between referencing a constant on a class versus an existing method, static method on the class. So that first set of parentheses is required. And if you were to run that, you would get the length of example printed out. We then construct an instance of string utils with the text merge PHP, and the next var dump will output the reverse of that. So PHP, I'm not going to try and pronounce merge backwards. And then the last var dump will run that transformation with the first class callable string to upper, which will result in merge PHP, except pretend that I was shouting. PHP Stan, as a version 2.1.32, which I believe was released like 2 days ago, now understands in constant expressions the way that closures, first class callables, and casts work. Generally, on the left of the slide, there'll be some example code using the new feature, and on the right, I'll talk about tooling that understands or supports it. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list of tooling. in the PHP universe, and my apologies if I missed your favorite. But these are the ones that I saw and saw had support for this feature by now. Now,
quick note before you
clone-
continue. Given that you're not on screen right now for camera, could you drop your camera feed? There are a couple audio issues that keep happening, so it's a mostly clean feed, but it would help if you dropped video. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Continue.
Camera has been turned off, and please feel free to interrupt me if you can't hear me. As much as I love the sound of my own voice, it's not the focus today. If I needed an echo chamber, I could, find a bathroom with good acoustics.
Right.
Anyway, having covered constant expressions, let's talk about clone width. On the left, we see a demo class where you have the publicly settable but only writable once value val. The public set is important, and I'll get to that in a second. But basically, a demo will hold some integer that can never be changed after the constructor. And if you wanted to clone with a new value, you would either need to make sure that value is written in the magic _clone method, or manually build up a new instance and set the properties yourself. You can now just call clone with a second parameter that is what properties you'd like to change. The reason the public set is important is that clone call will validate the visibility of properties that you are trying to write to. So without public set, read only is implicitly protected set since 8.4, and so in the global scope, the clone call would fail. If you have a _clone function defined, the logic there will run before the array of property overrides is applied. If you were to have multiple properties in that array, the different properties would be set in the order that they are in the array. Again, the visibility rules are enforced. Another great thing is that property hooks are applied. You're not just writing to the underlying value if it's a non-virtual property, but you are going through the different get hooks. And if the property doesn't have a hook and doesn't exist, without the allow dynamic properties attribute, you'll get a warning unless you have the _set set method, which will be called to non-lazy and is unlocked for the duration of that clone call. In both of them, once in the clone and one, but in both of them, you can only update the value once. Imagining how that can happen.
Looks like your audio muted and seeing some connectivity issues.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing.
Should be okay for now.
Where did I cut out?
Tim, I think you were paying more close attention than I was. Probably give it like 30 seconds ago.
Okay. So lazy objects are made non-lazy, and read-only properties are unlocked in that they can be written at most once in the clone function in the magic method, and at most once in property hooks, or the array of properties to set. The property hooks reference is that if you were to set two different properties in your width parameter, and one of them was hooked and tried to update the value of the other one, which is read-only, you would get an error. So you can write to the read-only property twice, but one of them would have to be in the clone and one would have to be in the width parameter. And PHP Stan, as of this week, now understands what you're trying to do when you are providing that second parameter. Pipe operator. The pipe operator is probably one of the most talked about new features for 8.5. It allows you to chain together any callable that can be called with one parameter. And if you look at the opcodes that PHP actually generates, it's a compile time trick that disappears from the runtime logic. And so it shouldn't add any performance overhead or anything like that. As a demonstration of the different types of callables that work, you can see some encoded data that is first imploded with no separator, and then reversed, and then base64 decoded, and then using the magic _invoke method on the anonymous class made capitalized. And if you run this, you should get pipes are cool, I believe is what the input was. This also serves as the groundwork for a partial function application. I believe there is an RFC currently underway to add that in 8.6. Partial function application would mean that you wouldn't need to add the anonymous arrow function that you see for the implode. You would instead be able to say, I'd like to implode with an empty string as the separator and some placeholder as the argument, and that would create a callable for you. But that's for an 8.6 talk. Rector 2.2.6 added support for a migration that would convert sequential assignments with repeated application of a callable or function call, convert that to a pipe. The name was clarified in the 2.2.7 release to make it clear that that is just for the sequential assignments. And if you'd like to update your nested function calls to use the pipe operator, there is also a rector rule to use that. And PHP Stan will understand what you are trying to do with the pipe operator as of this week. Next, we get to an RFC that is near and dear to my heart. This is a big reason why I got involved in contributing to PHP and how I got more familiar with the internals of how PHP actually works. I have a blog post on my site, scherzer.dev, that goes into more detail about that journey and the reasoning behind it. So I won't go in too much background there. But on the left, we can see that there is a namespaced constant named version and an unnamespaced global constant, some library version. Previously, there was no easy way to signal to users of your library or end users of an application that a constant is deprecated. It would be usable and then just disappear in a breaking change, and you would have an error message. 8.4 added support for attributes for the deprecated attribute emitting warnings when you use a class constant. And so I figured, let's try and add support for global constants. It was a lot more work than I expected, but now attributes can be added to global compile time constants. And by compile time, I mean those declared with the const keyword rather than using the define function. So the attribute class has a new constant for the target. The value of target all has changed to include that. So if you have an 8.4 attribute that you support targeting, the 6 options are, I believe, classes, functions, methods, class constants, parameters, and properties. If you'd like to target all of those but not constants, you will need to replace your target all with the actual list. There's a new method on the reflection constant class to get the attributes, and some tooling is available. PHP stand will validate, does your attribute support constants, and does your version of PHP support attributes on constants? And Rector will migrate comments in the form of @deprecated and then some details, migrate those comments from being above a constant to being implemented with an attribute on the constant. So it's not just your documentation that reflects the deprecation, but also your runtime. How's the audio sounding?
Good to go.
Okay, I haven't seen any complaints in the chat. So now we get to a couple of smaller improvements. Smaller in that they're self-contained, not that they're less useful. Asymmetric visibility is now possible with static properties, and PHP stand will validate your usage. We can see the example class has the public static property prop, but it could only be from the private scope or with reflection. Generally, any visibility can be you can get around that with reflection. Doesn't need to be pointed out every time. Same with the protected property. That can be modified from the same class, in this case example, or any subclass. And on the right, constructor property promotion is now available for final properties. This was another RFC of mine, and it actually came out of a bug report. I thought that the lack of support for final was just an oversight in the constructor property promotion implementation. I was then told that no, it wasn't. And so I converted that bug report to a feature and wrote an RFC. Again, there's a blog post talking about that on my site. Now, perhaps the largest change that's coming in 8.5 is the new URI extension. This is enabled by default, and it is, from what I understand, always enabled. So you cannot have 8.5 without this extension unless you start hacking around in the C code, at which point you're not running the official PHP anymore. URIs and URLs are easily confused, and I don't fully understand what applies in what contexts. But this talk is meant to be a high-level overview of what's coming in 8.5 rather than an exhaustive list of the meaning of all the parts. So I'll just say that the URI types comes from an RFC with a very formal grammar, and it's fixed, whereas the URLs are from a working group that is it has a living document that provides not a grammar for what is the correct URI, but an algorithm of how to handle inputs, including handling of malformed inputs that might not represent a perfect URL, but are still understandable. Both of them have a scheme, like HTTPS, a username and password. Those are commonly associated with basic HTTP auth. If you get the pop-up that says you need a username or password before you can even see the site. A host, for example, mergephp.com. The port is generally 80 or 443, depending on your protocol. The path, so that is your /test or whatever page you're on. The query, question mark, action equals edit, and fragment, the last part with the hashtag or pound sign, followed by the identifier of where on the page you are. And the League of PHP Coders, I believe, has a polyfill available. So you can start using that feature now, even if you aren't yet ready to upgrade your entire stack to 8.5. Now, on the topic of extensions that are always enabled, opcache. Opcache is always bundled and enabled in the sense that the extension is there and on, not in the sense that it is doing anything. In addition to the question of if opcache is enabled, there are two INI options. Confusingly, opcache.enable and .enable CLI that control if you're going to actually do anything. So if you wanted opcache, this just makes your life easier. You no longer need, if you're building PHP yourself, to tell it to enable opcache. You no longer need to add a Zend extension INI directive to load it. You just need to make sure that your opcache.enable and enable CLI INI directives aren't accidentally removed. If you don't want to use opcache, it's always going to be around, but you can disable it with the opcache.enable equals 0, for example. One small potential complication is that now that it is always there, the various opcache functions that it defines are always going to be there and conflict if you try and put one of your own in. But generally, functions should be namespaced or otherwise clear that they aren't part of a built-in extension like opcache. Another new INI option is for fatal error backtraces. If you don't do anything, this will still just improve your life because it defaults to on. It will respect arguments that are noted as sensitive parameters, and it will respect the INI option to hide arguments from exception traces, but it will allow you to, when you get a fatal error, for example, when a class is redeclared, when memory is exhausted, or when maximum execution time is exhausted, it'll give you a stack trace of what happened to get you there, which would have been so helpful at work a couple months back, where I spent way too long trying to figure out why some behavior, why some code path wasn't being reached, to eventually discover that there was an accidental infinite self-recursion further up the call stack. And so that exhausted all of the time, and the code that I wanted to run never was reached. Before I move on, I see a question in the chat from Derek. The new URI extension has objects to represent URIs and URLs. It's parsing and manipulating, and it's pure data. The fact that it can be polyfilled should show you that there's no magic functionality there that needs to be implemented in C. There's no system calls or anything else. It's just a utility tool, like the SPL classes, for example. It's just there to help you out. As long as you don't match that exact namespace, it shouldn't interfere with you if you don't want to use it. Hope that answered your question. Now we get a new attribute. I'm a big fan of attributes at work and in the PHP code that I was writing before I got involved in PHP development. I was writing a lot of code that was 7.4 compatible, and so I didn't get as much exposure to attributes until just over a year ago, and I really liked them. This one will trigger a compiler warning, or sorry, a runtime warning. If you are calling a method or function that wants the return value to be used and you don't actually use it. For example, for the date extension, there are wither methods where you say, okay, I want this with some modification. And an easy foot gun is that you might think that modifies the original object, but it doesn't. It returns a new one. And the point of no discard is that if you accidentally don't use the return value, you will get a warning. If you intentionally don't use the return value, you can suppress that warning by adding a void cast. Here, a void cast is very different from a void cast in C, for example. Here it's just saying, I'm calling this and ignoring the result. There is a polyfill for the existence of this attribute. You can see what it looks like on the left. And Symfony's 8.5 polyfills package has a version of this. There is also tooling that will complain when it's analyzing your code if you're calling methods and functions with this attribute and you aren't using them. So that way you don't need to wait until you get to the runtime to have that alert. That's available for both PHP Stan and Fan. And in addition to the versions, I'm also linking to all of the relevant commits, if I found them, that add the support. So if you're curious, you can look at how this is implemented. And so I can confirm that, oh, this is indeed the correct version number to include. Another new attribute, this is another RFC of mine, is delayed target validation. I'm going to be frank, this isn't going to be very useful until 8.6, but the way that internal PHP attributes are designed means that the earlier this was introduced, it had to be introduced in a version before it was useful. I'm going to point out a couple places where had this already been available in 8.4, for example, it would have been useful now. There is a polyfill for the existence of the attribute, but the functionality is very internal to PHP core, and so is not, you can't polyfill the functionality, just the attribute class itself. Improved attribute. The override attribute can now be used on properties to confirm that, for the same reason as a method can be annotated with override, to confirm that the property does exist in the base class. PHP Stan will give you analysis time warnings if the attribute validation is going to fail. It can also suggest to you to add it if you prefer to have it everywhere that it applies. And this is a place where delayed target validation would have been useful. If you want to get the benefit of this support for override on properties, it's a compile time warning to do this on 8.4. On the other hand, dropping 8.4 support is a pretty big step just to have the ability to validate all of your properties that are aware of this target for an internal attribute, in this case override, it would just be ignored. So had the delayed target validation, oh, I see a note about my audio. Dropping 8.4 support is a big step to take just to benefit from this attribute supporting properties. So this is why delayed target validation earlier. If you had this delayed target validation available in 8.4, and then on override attribute and the delayed target validation attribute. On 8.4, instead of compile time error for the attribute being on a target that it doesn't support, you would get a runtime error when you tried to instantiate that attribute, which you can ignore, you can catch it. And then on 8.5, it would work. And so this is why, even though delayed target validation doesn't seem useful now, the way attributes are designed, it wouldn't be useful in the version that it's introduced. It's meant for making PHP forward compatible with future changes. And as with the other RFCs of mine, delayed target validation has a write-up on my blog about the reasoning and how it works. Another RFC of mine, traits can now be marked as deprecated. And when you use the trait, you will get a warning. Static analysis tools, Fan and PHP Stan, will both emit warnings at analysis time when you are using traits that are marked as deprecated with this attribute, as will a relatively, yes, deprecated. I appreciate the pun in the chat. In addition to PHP Stan and Fan, a relatively new tool, Mago, which is written in Rust, will also emit these warnings. This is going to be the only mention of Mago. I just know that it has the support because I implemented it in my first ever Rust patch. I didn't actually know any Rust when I wrote that, which was fun, but it was accepted and it works. And again, had delayed target validation been around earlier, you would have been able to apply the deprecated attribute to your traits without 8.4 incompatibility by adding delayed target validation as well. And Bobby, this is a compile time warning for using the trait that is deprecated. We're getting towards the end of our list of new features. Persistent CURL handles. If you have the CURL or curl extension enabled and running, you initialize them with curl share init persistent, which returns an instance of a new class, which is essentially the same as the normal curl handle, except that instance can be reused between different requests to avoid needing to reconnect to whatever your target URL is each time. We'll note that while it does have most of the same options as normal, you cannot use the lock data cookie option for the shared handle, presumably because that would lock it across requests. And this is very tied to the C implementation and thus cannot be polyfilled. Early in the development of 8.5 RFC was chips. And for any of our British attendees, I don't mean French fries. I mean cookies having independent partition state. Basically, different browser. Oh,
You are now back. So you can continue.
Chips. Cookies having independent partitioned state. Not for any British viewers, and I'm sorry if you already heard this one. Not French fries. Basically, different browsers are increasingly trying to separate out top-level cookies and third-party cookies and give you more privacy options. And so one of the options that exists when when any web engine responds to your browser with the HTTP protocol about cookies is you can give the name and the content and the expiration, and you can add the partitioned flag that keeps that cookie separate from other domains in, I believe, the same hierarchy. Before PHP had this support built in, if you wanted to use partitioned cookies, you could. You would just need to manually call the header function with the desired cookie data. Or you could use Symfony's HTTP Foundation library that abstracted that away for you. And since 6.4.0 has supported partitioned cookies. But now PHP built-in functions support that as well via the set raw cookie. session get cookie params and session set cookie params. All of those when you're using the partitioned array key, or when you call session start with the cookie underscore partitioned array key. For those who use the filter extension, by default, when filter validation fails, if you say, I want this to be a valid email, and it's not, it'll return false. There is an existing flag, filter null on failure, that will return null. And now there's a flag, filter throw on failure, that will throw a new filter failed exception on that failure. You cannot use both null on failure and throw on failure. So pick one or the other. This was actually prompted by a feature request on GitHub. Normally, at least for relatively big features, those are closed with instructions to email the mailing list. But every so often, you'll have a developer come across a feature request and think, oh, I can implement that. And that's exactly what happened in this case. I came across it and thought I'd dive in. The use of an exception rather than returning a value that indicates failure is a form of out-of-band failures. You are signaling the failure condition in a different band of communication, in this case with exceptions, in a different band than you would signal success, which is the return value. And PHP Stan, as of this week, now understands this flag and the exception it can throw. A couple new functions that simplify life. If you want to get a reference to the current error handler or exception handler, there was a way to do that on the C. This is essentially what the polyfill is, but now you can just use these new functions directly. If there's no handler set, the function returns null, and Symfony's 8.5 polyfill package has polyfills for these. Symfony's 8.5 polyfills also has polyfills for array first and array last, which return the first and last elements of an array without changing the location of the internal pointer, so that's different from the reset function or the end function, where it gives you the first or last element, but it also changes where in the iteration you are. These both return null if the array is empty. And in addition to Symfony's polyfills, there is a dedicated composer package just to polyfill these two functions. If you'd like to use these widely, there is a rector rule available to migrate your manual calls to array key first and array key last, and getting those array elements to instead use the new functions. This is just a big quality of life improvement. Now we get to some deprecations. There are a lot of deprecations. I will go through them fairly quickly, but my slides are public and will be available. And these have all been talked about a lot. This is just, if you haven't heard, here are some things that have been deprecated. Using a semicolon after the case statement or the default statement is deprecated. There are plenty of tools that will complain and even fix it for you. Those are listed on the right, along with the versions from which that warning or that fix is available. Casting with non-standard names. If you try and cast a string or try and cast a number with a binary cast, you might think that gives you the binary representation as a string. Nope, it's just the string. Boolean, double, and integer are pretty clearly named, but they're still not the standard version of the cast. And so we have PHP has deprecated the use of the non-standard cast names on the left side of the table with the suggestion to replace them with the version on the right side. And there's tooling that can do that for you. Backticks for shell exec. This I found when I first started doing PHP to be a big foot gun. Backticks in other languages do not trigger command execution. They're used for templates and things. So if you were using those previously, you can always just suppress the deprecation warning, but you should update your code to instead call shell exec and make it clearer in your code that this is actually a system call. And on the right, you'll see tools that do that for you. If you try and use null as an array offset, trying to get the array value with the key null, it will work just like an empty string, but anyone reading it would probably be confused, or it might indicate a mistake if you didn't just hard code null, but it came from somewhere else. If a function returns a string or null, and you're expecting it to be a string, this might be an issue. And so that is now deprecated. You can just replace all of your uses of null in these contexts with an empty string, and it'll work the same. And this applies to both the array offset and the array key exists method, or function, excuse me. And there is tooling available. The question mark next to the fan version is that fan gets a lot of its information about parameter values and types from reflection data. And I couldn't quite pin down what version of PHP reflection data and what version of fan together first emitted this warning, but it is emitted now. If you try and use null for array key exists, it'll give you, it's a mismatched argument type. And if you try and use null for an array offset, it'll say it's an invalid dimension. See, I'm running low on time. The magic debug info method can return null. That's equivalent to returning an empty array. Please return an empty array. Null is deprecated. Tooling will complain or migrate for you. There are some function aliases that are deprecated. These are identical to the replacement version. They're just an alias, which is a function in PHP core that is not directly exposed to user land, having multiple names for just the same exact function. You can always just forward the call, but now you should just replace the version on the left with the one on the right, and there's tooling to point it out to you. CHR and ORD are two functions that are used to convert between string characters and ASCII values for the underlying character. CHR will take the number that you give it, perform a bitwise AND with the number 255, and then return the corresponding ASCII character with that code. Values outside the range of 0 to 255 are silently truncated, and just only those last 8 bits are used. And now if you try and pass a value outside of the range, you will get a warning. And there's a rector rule to migrate. ORD will take the first character and give you back the ASCII code that it represents. Because of the way that strings are stored in PHP, if you have an empty string, that is actually storing a single character null with one L, generally, for the ASCII code, which would then, so there is a character for it to examine, but you might be confused by that. So ORD on an empty string will return 0, but you probably weren't expecting, an empty string there is likely an error. And if you have multiple characters, it will only work on the first, but again, you're misusing that function in that case. And so there is a rector rule to migrate your uses. Since the migration to objects instead of resources in PHP 8 and 8.1, there are some close or free or destroy functions that are no longer needed. They are now officially deprecated. If you want to support older versions of PHP and make the free call version dependent, you can use rector version 2.1.5 and above up to 2.2.4, at which point it just removes all of your calls to these functions with the default 8.5 configuration. And I know I'm running a few minutes over. I will try and get through these quickly. The getDefined functions function will return an array of all functions, excluding disabled ones, since 8.0. And so you don't need to tell it to exclude disabled ones, and doing so is now deprecated. Reflection methods and properties since 8.1 have always been accessible. You could always access the private data without needing to say explicitly, make it accessible first, because this is reflection. When this RFC was done in 8.1, they made a decision not to immediately deprecate the set accessible calls, but it's been a couple of years, and now calling set accessible explicitly is deprecated. If you call reflection class getConstant for a constant that's missing, it returns null, but that could also be a valid constant value. And so now that's deprecated, and you can check if the constant exists before calling getConstant with hasConstant. Same with getDefaultValue returning null, which is also a valid default. These are other examples of in-band versus out-of-band signaling of failures. The return of what could be a valid value to indicate a missing value gets confusing, and so it's deprecated. SPL object storage has a couple of methods that are aliases, and those aliases are deprecated. You can see the replacement chart on the left. The SPL extension has a way to unregister all of the autoloaders. If you ever wanted to do that, you would probably write the function on the right, or the code on the right, but there was also a shortcut that you can see on the left. That shortcut is now deprecated if you ever want to remove your autoloaders. The HTTP response header variable contains response data from functions like file get contents, for example. This is a magic variable, an auto global, in that it gets defined automatically, but conditionally based on whether or not you just called a function that sets that. So now you should no longer rely on that variable being defined automatically. And if you need to support older versions of PHP, you can check if the get last response headers function is available. And if it is, you can set that variable accordingly, and it will be safe to use. This is a compile time error, which means the code on the left will still trigger a compile time error, even though it won't trigger a runtime error about an undefined or unknown variable, because we're not checking. It's entirely an analysis of the syntax and of the code used. And so that's why the replacement to just, set the value is safe. Rewind, closing, and reading from directories can all be done without actually giving a directory, which means just use the most recent one. Don't do that, it's deprecated. The PDO extension has a bunch of driver-specific constants on the base PDO class. Those are now deprecated. You should use the version of the constant or method on the subclass of PDO for whichever database driver you're using, and Rector will simplify that migration for you. The finfo buffer function accepts a context parameter that doesn't actually do anything. That can be removed. The same is true of the method version of that function. The PDO extension also has a scheme where instead of giving it the database information to connect to, you say, please go read from this URI and connect to the database information in the response. This is not a good idea. There are security issues. You're basically asking for what database to connect to. You're asking some resource elsewhere. If you really want to do that, you can manually fetch the URI's first line and then pass that to the PDO constructor. The RFC has details on how to do that. There are some existing warnings that are now explicitly deprecated and will are expected to result in exceptions or errors in PHP 9. If you try and redefine a constant, that will emit a warning. You should, if you aren't positive that the constant isn't already defined, you can wrap the definition code in a if not defined, whatever your constant. Closures, any of the 7 warnings shown on the right are now also deprecated. This happens generally when you are confusing instance methods and static methods, or changing the scope or this usage of an existing closure. Array object allows treating arrays as objects and calling methods on them. It also allows treating objects as objects, but represented with an array of their internal properties, which breaks engine assumptions. It bypasses visibility. It bypasses read-only. You can change the name of an enum case. It can break. There have been plenty of reports that have been closed with the general suggestion of just don't use array object. And now, if you do, it's deprecated when used around objects. Using an array object for an array is fine. And the same is true for the array iterator class. The last few deprecations are that the PDO version of the Postgres connection exposes a whole bunch of constants about the transaction status, but nowhere does it actually expose the transaction status. So those are deprecated. If you want to connect to Postgres databases and have transaction information, use the dedicated Postgres extension. OpenSSL pkey derive accepts a key length parameter that is problematic. If it's higher than the actual key size, it does nothing. And if it's lower, it will either truncate the key or just break entirely. Parameter was not doing what you might expect, or if you were expecting it to do this, not doing something useful. And so it's deprecated. I think this is the last one. The date extension has a constant and a class constant for RFC 7231. And you can see the string value of that constant on the left. All 3 of those var dumps have the same result. But when you use this format, it would ignore the associated timestamp or time zone, and always use GMT, which could get very confusing. And so using either the global constant or the class constant is now deprecated. PHP internally had the ability to deprecate global constants. Now it can do so with a helpful error message, the same way you get from the deprecated attribute. There are a few INI options that are deprecated. There is a PHP code sniffer sniff that will report if you are trying to change them. This is report memleaks, which is only for debug builds. So unless you are a developer of PHP like me and are building PHP from the source, you probably wouldn't have even seen this. It allows suppressing reports of memory issues, which you shouldn't suppress because those indicate a bug in PHP. Registering the argc and argv globals. This is hard-coded to be on for the command line and other embedded APIs. And the internationalization extension error level. Internationalization errors can be sent out as both PHP errors, like e-warning, e-notice, and as exceptions. And you could configure it to use both, which was confusing. And so now it's suggested just use exceptions. The error level is deprecated. I believe this should be our last one. The sleep and wake up magic methods were proposed for deprecation and accepted. And then it turned out there was a much bigger impact than initially thought. And so these are only soft deprecated, meaning that the documentation says they're deprecated, but there are no warnings. This is an even easier deprecation to ignore. But if your code does not need to be backwards compatible with much older versions of PHP, you can migrate to a newer serialization structure. Output handler problems. If your output handler tries to echo something within the actual handler function, that doesn't go anywhere. And now trying to output it will emit a deprecation. If you were also testing any version before RC5, which is likely because I announced RC5 just over an hour ago, there was also a deprecation if you returned something other than a string from the output handler, but that has been reverted. So that's just, if you were testing yesterday and today, you might notice a change. Couple new warnings were introduced. If you try and convert nan to a string, Boolean, or an array, you will get a warning. If you try and convert a float that cannot be represented as an int to an int, you will get a warning. And if you try and destruct a scalar, null, or resource value, you will get a warning. If you were destructing an object, you would already get that. But for scalars, for example, the first and second being assigned to 123, this just assigns both of those values to null. A couple of breaking changes. The disable classes INI option has been removed because all of the classes that are built into core are safe. If there's an extension that adds some classes that you want to disable, you should just disable that extension. There, to instead of having an error that, oh, this class is gone, you will just get a warning that, oh, I see that I cut out. So this is a breaking change in that it removes functionality, but all of the built-in classes are considered safe. And if there's an extension with a class that you would like to disable, then you should just not have that extension enabled. This can be replaced kind of with a PHP code sniffer rule to complain anytime you use some class that you'd like to forbid. This won't stop the code from actually instantiating and using that class, but it'll help you avoid instances of that class appearing in your code. And I believe finally, the directory class is now final. It cannot be manually constructed, cloned, or serialized, or have properties created on it. This class comes from the dir function for directory, and now it matches other resource objects where the contents are opaque. But this predates the resource to object migration. Thank you for bearing with me. I know I went a bit over and I was dealing with technical issues. I will now take questions if anyone has them. I can also go back to any of the slides and give more detail if that would be requested. Let me pull up the chat.
Looks like we don't have additional questions on here. It does look like 8.5 is a pretty massive release in terms of cleaning up potential footguns in the language and saying like, hey, if you're doing X, Y, and Z, you're probably doing it wrong. There are refactors that if you insist on doing it that way, you can still do that, but you actually have to admit that you're doing something weird, which is, it's good to see. So I've got one question there.
Yes.
Just landed in the chat.
I see that for those watching on YouTube where this might not be accessible, the question was, currently it's possible to declare constants in a base class and then override them in child classes. Will this break in PHP 8.5? It shouldn't. That should still be allowed. Personally, I think that overriding constants like that can be a bit confusing. I also have an idea for an RFC to add the override attribute, add support for that on constant, specifically to call out places where that is intentional, because it seems like a foot gun to me. But no, that should not break.
You can still.
I'm happy to stick around for a couple of minutes if anyone thinks of any others.
I think we're good. Folks have had the chance to ask questions during the chat. So thanks for having a comprehensive walkthrough presentation for this. Definitely more detail than I've provided on previous versions of, or previous PHP versions of this presentation that I've done. With that, thanks to everyone who has shown up for this month's Merge PHP. And I guess we will, let's see here. Yeah, we'll see y'all at the next one in December. And again, PHP 8.5 RC 5 now is out. You can play with it for the next couple of weeks, and then PHP 8.5 will be GA quite shortly. So
a week from today is when it's expected to be GA.
Well, congratulations on kind of release managing something almost to the finish line, and just will be at the GA at least finish line here shortly. Of course, there's plenty of patches and maintenance updates for years to come with this, of course.
Yes.
All right, I'll close down the stream, and thanks so much, Daniel, for presenting this evening.
Thanks for having me.